And finally, let's look at the ball at the tip. So this node group isn't that big. I start out with my base, which is for once a little bit more complicated than usually. So what I used here is a Voronoi texture that I warped with a noise texture, and then I used this to generate color, roughness and height outputs. And for the height I went with a very high contrast. I crushed the blacks and just left the whites. And this is because in one of the references I saw the ball had kind of a rougher surface. It had kind of subtle but relatively clear pattern across the whole surface in the bump channel, which I quite liked. So I wanted to incorporate that in my material. So I created this kind of sharp pattern. Next, I added a couple of divots, which are just Musgrave textures, pretty much show this the same way I explained before. It's just Musgrave textures mixed together using the multiply blend mode. And I also added a noise texture just to reduce the density. Then I added some organic scratches, which are basically the same thing I did for the organic damage on the metal tip. It's the same texture. I cranked up the contrast, mixed a couple of noise textures, played around with some warping and stuff, and that's how I eventually got this. Next I added the ink, which is the same principle I used on the metal tip, except in this case it's slightly more complicated. Here I used a grunge texture, which I warped with a low resolution noise texture to get this kind of organic flowing pattern. Then I constrained this to the edges using a gradient texture and a color ramp. And then I took the image again and warped the blue channel, specifically because I wanted to have some ink at the tip, which is, when I looked at the reference, it was more smeared, sort of long streaks. So I mapped it in a way that would create this long pattern around the tip of this ball. And that's why I am warping it on only one axis. And then once I crank up the contrast, you can see this pattern of these lengthy streaks. And then I added this to the rest of the mask. Next I added some directional noise. Again, just some tiny details to make the surface look less flat. And finally some dust particles. I saw that in the reference often there was some dust, tiny debris particles on the ball. Presumably they are sticking to the ink on the ball. So I wanted to add those, and these are just several nice textures mixed together using the multiply blend mode. Two different variations I added together. I removed them from the metalness map, added them to the height channel, and used it as a mask for a like gray sort of color in the color map. And that's pretty much the final material. So yeah, that's all the materials I made for this project. That took way longer to explain than I anticipated. Anyways, I hope that's helpful and answers some of your questions regarding material creation in Blender and how I go about creating materials.